Hello, my name is Andre Ward, and I'm the Associate Vice President of Policy at the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy at the Fortune Society. Welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion-driven show that examines the criminal legal system from various intersections and various perspectives, including people that are most impacted by the criminal legal system. We discuss vital and important and critical questions about how the criminal legal system works, its intersections with social justice, and we highlight the efforts of those who seek to make improvements for those who are affected by the criminal legal system. We ask you to join the Fortune Society by going to our website, www.fortunesociety.org, or going to Facebook and joining us at Fortune Society. Today's show is entitled 5 Ways to Improve Public Safety Without Over-Policing and Mass Incarceration. We found in our research that with 2023 marking 50 years of mass incarceration in the United States, the prison population has expanded by 500% since 1973. And there is a clear need to reimagine the country's public safety infrastructure, according to a new report by the Sentencing Project, which advocates for effective and humane responses to crime. And the report described 5 social interventions that research shows are more effective at reducing crime and improving public safety, more cost-effective and more equitable than punitive responses that rely on over-policing and mass incarceration. Today's guest is Liz Komar, and the report's author and the Sentencing Reform Counsel at the Sentencing Project. And this country has a powerful opportunity to expand on programs that improve safety while scaling back incarceration, says Liz. And so Liz is a Sentencing Reform Counsel at the Sentencing Project. She advocates for an end to extreme sentencing in the state and federal criminal legal systems as part of the Sentencing Project's campaign to end life imprisonment, including by leading federal advocacy efforts. And prior to joining the Sentencing Project, she was the director of strategic initiatives at Fair and Just Prosecution, an organization dedicated to reforming prosecutorial practices and culture. And she also served as an assistant district attorney in Brooklyn, New York, and as an attorney advisor in the U.S. Department of Justice Executive Office of Immigration Review. Liz, thank you so much for joining us here at Both Sides of the Bars. Really appreciate you coming on this show, doing some incredibly important work. And we want to acknowledge that and certainly explore that on this show today. How are you feeling?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me. It's always a privilege to be here.
Absolutely. And so Liz, going right into it, could you describe your latest report? It's a seminal work, but describe your latest report, Safety Beyond Sentencing, and what the Sentencing Project's goals were in writing it.
Sure. So we often meet with policymakers to talk about how extreme sentences don't make us safer. If people are worried about crime, they're worried about violence in their communities, the answer isn't to double down on failed approaches, sentencing more people to life without parole, imposing more 20-plus year sentences. And then that leads to a question of, well, if that's not the answer to make us safer, what is? And so this brief, along with my co-author, Nicole Porter, begins to answer that question. And it's really just a brief introduction to the wealth of work and research and interventions out there, that there are so many studies, so many implementation guides and projects, many run by people who are formerly incarcerated themselves or who have loved ones behind bars, that are already creating the kind of change in communities that we need to see on a larger scale. So the goal of this report was just to answer that a fundamental question of what can we begin to think about instead for people who are new to this conversation, and also to lift up the wonderful work already underway, because the people who are really experts on how to make us safer without mass incarceration are the people in the streets doing the work every day. And oftentimes that's folks who've been to prison themselves and are coming back and working in violence prevention and similar projects like that.
And, again, looking at this and having reviewed this seminal work, when we think about this work, Liz, what came out of it were a series of recommendations, 5 to be more specific. So, could you walk us through those recommendations, because they're significant as it relates to this report that you all have put out?
Sure, thank you. So First, I want to say that the research around many of these interventions is still new and evolving. So our recommendations highlight areas with potential. They highlight programs that we should investigate in more, that we should fund more, because we're still figuring out the answers to how to create safety without more punishment. And so we looked at the field of interventions that are out there and tried to put them into 5 categories. And the first of which is implementing community safety solutions. So these are community-based interventions that aren't run by the police, such as violence interruption programs, changes to the built environment, things like better street lighting, that we know from initial research are a promising approach to decreasing violence without increasing incarceration. The second kind of group of recommendations are around transforming crisis response. And so if people in the community are having some sort of mental health crisis or they're experiencing an overdose, it's important to shift responses away from the police to trained community-based responders. And that has the potential to not only reduce police shootings, but also improve safety and decrease incarceration. The third category is reducing unnecessary justice system involvement. We criminalize a lot of stuff we don't need to criminalize. And the answer there isn't always to divert people. It can just be to stop criminalizing things. And so we suggest ending unnecessary police contact and court involvement, and instead diverting some offenses, but maybe just not touching other things, such as loitering or other things that we call crimes that are really about the offense of being poor in public. And there's promising research that shows that sometimes the answer is just for the court system to not get involved at all. Fourth, we suggest ending the drug war. I think a lot of your watchers will already understand why that's important, that criminalizing people who use drugs hasn't worked, and we need public health solutions. And then finally, we suggest strengthening opportunities for youth. Because programs like summer employment opportunities or training youth in effective decision-making skills are really promising means of reducing their contact with the criminal legal system.
Yeah, and obviously these recommendations seem to have been well thought out and certainly are likely to be implementable. And so in thinking about that, Liz, right, again, the report highlights promising interventions, right, for improving public safety that already exist, right? So if we know that these programs have the potential to improve public safety, I guess the question then is, Liz, why aren't they more widespread?
I think almost everyone who's ever worked in a diversion program or in some sort of crime prevention program knows this answer, and it's that non-carceral reforms are held to a different standard than the status quo. When lawmakers reauthorize the budget of the police, when they decide to put more funding into the correctional system, they don't do that while simultaneously looking at whether those are effective at reducing crime. We tend to hold diversion programs or crime prevention programs to a tougher standard. We want results right away. And those results are often in terms of we want to see an immediate reduction in crime, as opposed to also looking at maybe it's just a meaningful goal to reduce incarceration while perhaps crime remains the same. Maybe that has a net benefit in the end. And so that's an incredibly tough challenge that a lot of diversion or prevention programs face. We also expect results really quickly, which is tough because it's really hard to replicate interventions across cities sometimes. Every community is a little bit different. And so sometimes that means it takes programs a couple years to figure out how to be optimal, to have the great outcomes that another site in a different city had. And we don't hold police to that same standard. And so that combined with our tendency to throw up our hands and say, well, there's just not money for these reforms, means that we often don't take things to scale that we have a lot of evidence work or have the potential to.
And as you're talking about, Liz, right, from state to state, from community to community, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, right, it varies, right, in terms of the responses to these implementable interventions. And what do you think could be ways in which different states could amplify right, the need for these interventions in some way, right, as a loose kind of question, right? What do you think some of the things that people can do, right, to kind of
Sure.
get their communities, their jurisdictions, and other places, right, to support this?
Sure. So first of all, there have been many creative ways that communities have funded these kind of preventative approaches.
Mhm.
One way that is used in Seattle is just a tax that funds their mental health infrastructure.
Mhm.
That's going to be a political no-go in many communities. So what I would also say is if there's no money in your budget for a new social service program, that's not a reason to avoid public safety reform. It's a sign you absolutely can't afford to keep the status quo.
Mhm.
Because when we don't invest in a humane social safety net, the prisons and emergency rooms act as one by default, and they're so much more expensive. So, just to give an example of what that looks like in reality, let's say someone has a serious mental health crisis. There's no kind of non police responder program where a social worker comes to their aid, and instead the police are called. That's a situation we all know is risky. And they have
Mhm.
one tool, which is often arrest someone, or at best, they may also drop someone off at the ER. And both of those are really expensive. Both come with a lot of time and paperwork for the officer. The routine process of taking someone to an emergency room can involve a dozen hours of overtime. And that's one or two or more officers off the street not doing what taxpayers generally expect them to do. And then once that person sees a doctor, what happens? Maybe a costly psych hold and then no long-term support. Or if they're arrested, of course, the situation's even worse and the case costs are extraordinary. We're paying for the salaries of lawyers and judges and prolonged detention then. And what if instead that community just had non-police responders and a 24-hour crisis center, a place where people can go to de-escalate the crisis, connect to care? What if the hospital and the local court system work together to identify the most costly folks who are continuously cycling through both of those doors and prioritized affirmative outreach to them? Those are real examples of ways that jurisdictions like Miami or Bexar County have funded their mental health reforms. And they show that there are ways to save money and create safety that don't have to rely on prisons.
Yeah, and when you think about, I mean, here in New York City, to jail someone on Rikers Island for 1 year is a little over $500,000, which is the amount that translates into offering 13 people supportive housing. And so we look at the huge cost savings there for people who are looking to access supportive housing, who may have had some contact with the criminal legal system. When we talk about diversion and other implementable um, recommendations that you kind of reference in your in the report, one of the things that come to mind, right? Again, a lot of the interventions in the report seem like they require significant funding, right? Kind of going back to that a little bit, Liz, and for communities or leaders who are ready to make changes today, right? But who don't have, like you said, I think the budget, right? And kind of getting back into that to do things like implement an expensive new program. So how can they get started, Liz? Anything that you can offer to our viewers, right? That how could they get started in this process?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, with mental health in particular, there's an opportunity for cross system reform. And the National Association of Counties has a lot of really great resources on this, on how local healthcare systems and local court systems can work together to make sure that people receive care instead of cycling through ER and jail doors repeatedly. And that's a wonderful way to free up resources to make communities safer. And then in the realm of violence, homicide comes with so many incalculable costs. So does any kind of serious violence. It's the loss of a human being, a family member, a father, a child, a lifetime of grief for survivors. And it also comes with costs to the community that we can calculate: healthcare costs, the costs of investigation and incarceration, and violence prevention programs are more affordable. Communities can't afford to not try to prevent that harm, both for the moral reason that we have to keep people alive, but also because it's just good fiscal policy. And so I encourage folks to consider both those opportunities for cross-system collaboration and also kind of stemming the bleeding when it comes to violence and prioritizing prevention there, because if you save one life, you've done something incredibly important. You've saved the world for that person, but you've also saved a lot of resources, and that's a meaningful way to help fund these programs.
And you've been doing this work for quite some time, Liz, as a defense attorney, right? You've done this work, and so you understand it. And how significant is this in your experience, right, to public safety, right? You've seen how different administrations may have approached addressing public safety throughout their different tenures. How do you see public safety now? Right? How do you see that as a part of the report that you wrote?
Sure. So, the way I view public safety, I think is shaped a lot by the opportunities I've had to see how it works in other countries. So, to visit Germany, for instance, with a group of elected prosecutors and talk to them about, well, how is your rate of violence so much lower? And also, why aren't you incarcerating people with serious mental illness? Why isn't this an intractable problem for you? And the answer is generally always a public safety net, that people have access to healthcare and housing, the things they need much more readily. And the answer is also just less firearms, although that's a different, really tough problem. And so that's shaped a lot of my understanding of the urgency and efficacy of these reforms. But in terms of like this moment in time, which I think is part of what you're asking too, the pandemic exposed so many of the gaps in the little social safety net we have. And it interrupted what programs we do have that work. And I think it showed us as a country how vulnerable that means we are on the public safety front. That, in some cities we saw a brief increase in crime that now is thankfully returning to normal, and some that return to normal hasn't happened yet because the community hasn't recovered from the harm and trauma of the pandemic. And then there are still such lingering wounds underneath that are a result of our history of racism. There's a lot of repair that we still need to do as a country, and that often begins with just stopping the violence, with ceasing to criminalize things that are mental illnesses. And so, public safety is when everyone can be on their front porch without fear. It's when everyone has what they need, and there's so much we can do to get there.
And Liz, you mentioned, right, the criminalizing of people that have some mental health issues. There's also the criminalizing of substance use, right, as well, criminalizing of homelessness. And we have taken an approach sometimes as a country to criminalize these areas when someone like the interventions that you may have mentioned or other recommendations that are coming from the field are suggesting alternatives, right, and other ways to engage that strengthens public safety in some way. And as we think about this, Liz, what might be your vision too, right, for the future around this? And then I have one more question for you. I know I've asked you few questions, but what is like your vision, right? And I think you mentioned it, right, where people can sit out on their front porch or what have you, and feel safe. Any other thoughts or reflections on that?
Yeah, I think safety begins with care, and I have had the privilege of having access to housing all my life, having access to the healthcare that I have needed. As a person in recovery, I had access to the care that I required. I've gone on to have a wonderful, fulfilling life that's has plenty of meaning, and that's what everyone should have. That's what humans are entitled to. And so I think when we create safety, we have to start there with making sure people's basic needs are met, their roof is over their heads, that they're well, that we come together as a community to help create that as we work to create it on a broader scale. And, I want everyone to have what I have had. And I think that's a baseline for justice.
And we're obviously running out of time, which is unfortunate because I'm sure we can talk pretty long on this issue because you deeply care about it, and so do I, and so do we here at the Fortune Society. And, if people want to learn more about how, they can make communities safer without prisons and take action, like what are some good resources that you can offer our viewers?
So the book We Keep Us Safe by Zach Norris is a really wonderful introduction to a lot of these programs and recommendations. For New Yorkers, of course, following your work, as well as the Center for Justice Innovation. On the academic side, John Jay put together an incredibly helpful survey of violence prevention approaches for local leaders. Shout out to the National Association of Counties again. But for, a general watcher who's just figuring out ways to get involved, there's so much work underway in your community already, whether that's reclaiming a vacant lot as a community garden or advocating for that bulb to be replaced in the streetlight that really needs it. And that all creates safety. So there's so much that everyone can do. There's so much that people are already doing. And there's so many folks who have been doing this work for decades who are closest to the solution. And so it's almost a question of where to start. There's so many options.
Absolutely. Liz, in the correct pronunciation of your last name is Komar. Is that correct?
Komar, yeah.
Komar, right? So Liz Komar, obviously, you won't be a stranger here to us because we would like to certainly have you back on for some updates. Again, Liz Komar is the Sentencing Reform Counsel at the Sentencing Project and co-authored a really important report called 5 Ways to Improve Public Safety Without Over-Policing and Mass Incarceration. We strongly encourage you as a viewer to check it out. We think it's something that will inform you in a way that you can become inspired and empowered, and by extension, inspire and empower other people, right, to take action, right, to support the recommendations that she and the co-author with her had written in the report. And we ask that you continue to look for ways by which to join organizations and coalitions and other groups that do criminal legal system reform and policy related work. And, again, Liz, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you for sharing your thoughts and your ideas. And we thank you, the viewers, for joining us as well, for here at both sides of the bars. In the meantime, if you're interested in finding out more about the Fortune Society, you can simply check us out on fortune.org. That's fortunesociety.org to find out more about us. You can also find us on Facebook by typing in fortunesociety.org. My name is Andre Ward, and as always, we thank you for joining us here at Fortune Society, and we ask that you continue to stay on both sides of the bars. Be well.
If you want to know how to reduce crime in America, in New York City, you do it one person at a time, creating an environment that celebrates the human spirit. Recidivism is a result of societal failure to do that, and Fortune has demonstrated that lives can change.
I tell people all the time, this is where I grew up. This is where I learned what being a man is and what being a productive citizen means.
It is the work of this great organization that has helped to shape my ideas, drive my conviction, and further deepen my commitment to the cause.
For more than half a century, you have amplified the voices of those who are impacted by unfair policies and helped thousands of justice-involved people transform their lives. You have led by example to show how we can help formerly incarcerated individuals come home, rebuild their lives, and contribute to our communities.
It's never about the contract or the milestones first. It's always about the individual. These individuals were literally suffering in incarceration because they just didn't have an address to go to. And for them to walk into a place where it's about them and only them and what they need and only what they need,
There's one person in particular, he came through our programs and he ended up opening his own construction company, and he came back to Fortune and said, I want to hire people from here, and it was like about how if you lift one person up, they lift others. Even if it's just one person that this happens to, it's worth it. And I know that it's not just one person, it's many people.
COVID-19 worsened existing barriers to reentry. Reentry is hard enough as is, but even harder during a pandemic. As people were released from Rikers early due to COVID-19, our services and housing were needed even more.
Fortune Society has kept their doors open during the pandemic. We offer them incentives when they arrive to the community, as well as refer them to specific resources. And we also host our workshops virtually where the clients are able to remain engaged. And we also launched our care package program, and where we were able to provide over 200 care packages with toiletries to clients that were released into the community.
Fortune's mission is more important than ever. It's a two-pronged mission. The service part is about being there for people as they rebuild their lives after experience in the criminal justice system. And as we give our services, we see the barriers that people face, and we do fierce advocacy about job discrimination, housing discrimination, conditions of confinement, and all of the albatrosses that are hung around the necks of people as they finish their time and try to build new lives.
Fortune Society is at the forefront of hope and lasting positive change.